Well, good evening and welcome to Stories for the Cooped Up and Captive. Well, hopefully, all of us have a few of those people in our lives who come to us at a time when we are vulnerable or in need. They bring an energy, a spirit, or a perspective that not only gets us over the hill, but probably sticks with us for the rest of our days. One of those people is a man named John Humphreys. John owns a company called Lizard Head Cycling Guides. He specializes in guiding trips way back in the way back. He was dealing in digital detaches almost before the cell phone was invented. Now, they say that splendor is delivered in increments of discomfort, if not suffrage. As such, John's job is to convince people who have been pushed well past what they perceived as their limits, who are saddle sore, broken, and frozen to the bone, that they're having the times of their lives. But the other thing that he'll do is he'll introduce you to a lady named Mariah. One of my last trips with John was in Nova Scotia, late October, early November. Now, you might ask yourself, who in their right minds goes to Nova Scotia in late October? Well, the answer to the question is nobody, because I'm not claiming in any way, shape, or form that we are in our right minds. But this was to be Rick's last ride. Who's Rick? Well, Rick Barner, Dr. Hedrick Boyd Barner, I took my first trip with him when he was well into his 70s. Now, if you asked Rick what he did for a living, you might be able to get him to admit that he's a retired physician. But if you want the rest of the story, you have to Google him. If you do, you'll find out that Rick has authored somewhere around 133 research papers, chapters in textbooks, and pioneered the technique by which just 1 second. The big stink is in need of some love. As such, he has also pioneered the procedure by which surgeons harvest the radial artery and bypass the greater coronary artery. Yeah, Dr. Barner is the father of cardiac bypass surgery. He has probably saved tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. This trip in Nova Scotia was to be Rick's last ride. I wasn't going to miss it for the world. Well, the last day of this trip brought us to Cape Breton, and there's this legendary road around the periphery of Cape Breton called the Cabot Trail. It is spectacular like words. It's like a mountain that rises out of the North Atlantic. Well, the last day of the trip, we woke to a wind so vicious that my first go at riding, I got blown squarely into the ditch. Went back to my hotel and pulled out every piece of polypropylene, fleece, and rubber that I owned, put on my lobster claw gloves, my shoe covers, and my balaclava, and I took off up the hill. Now, the first 3 hours of this trip was a straight-up climb. The wind off the North Atlantic felt as if my face was being sandblasted with salt water. Halfway up, I looked down to see icicles hanging off my top bar. When I arrived at lunch, my hands were so cold I had to hold my sandwich with 2 hands. But we took off after lunch, and it started to warm up just a little bit. And when we rounded the horn of the Cape, all of a sudden, that headwind that had been trying to blow us back to Halifax all day long was suddenly at our back. And we dropped behind the mountain, and the sun that was setting into the west was on our face. John powered his way to the front of our peloton, raised his arms like Lance Armstrong crossing the Champs-Élysées in the Tour de France, and says, "Do you feel it, people? Do you feel it? It's Mariah." When the wind is at your back and the sun is in your face, he calls it Mariah. Well, as of late, we've had a little bit of headwinds. So by my way of thinking, if we should be so fortunate that we get the wind at our back and the sun at our face, we have to stop, appreciate it, experience it. So, if all else fails, by all means, keep something moving forward. And if you see a big, great cat coming your way, rub his belly. It'll make him happy.